Welcome to Podkey Slopcast, where AI policy fights are starting to look like market design. The loud version of this story is open versus closed, America versus China, safety versus speed. The more interesting version is who gets to decide which models are normal, legal enough, and commercially usable. The White House seems to be moving away from a purely voluntary posture on AI and towards something closer to practical control over open source or open weight releases. That matters because formal bans are only one way to shape a market. You can also make companies feel that using certain models is risky enough that they self-censor before any explicit prohibition arrives. The proposed clearinghouse, nicknamed Gold Eagle, is a good example of that ambiguity. On paper, a clearinghouse that tracks software vulnerabilities sounds straightforward, even useful. In practice, if the same mechanism also helps determine which firms can access frontier models, then it's doing two jobs at once: security coordination and gatekeeping. Those are not identical functions, and combining them raises obvious questions about transparency, appeals, and whether access decisions become an industrial policy tool under a security label. There's also talk of a FINRA-style self-regulatory organization for open-source AI. The strongest case for that idea is that government capacity is limited, and a specialized body could create standards faster than Congress can write statutes. The strongest critique is also easy to see. Self-regulatory bodies often end up favoring firms that already have compliance departments, lawyers, and Washington relationships. If that happens here, then oversight could become a polite way to raise the cost of participation until only incumbents can comfortably play. The soft law angle is especially important. Warnings, compliance signals, and flood-type measures can work without ever producing a headline-grabbing ban. For regulated enterprises, the legal question is often less, is this forbidden? And more, will my board, auditor, bank, insurer, or agency examiner hate this? Once that mindset kicks in, the government doesn't need perfect enforcement. It just needs enough uncertainty to redirect behavior. That context helps explain why the open weight debate has gotten so heated. Critics like Dean Ball have argued that publishing open weight models is decelerationist and could lead to what he calls a kind of full AI communism where powerful models become public goods. That's not a technical claim alone, it's also an economic and ideological claim about who should capture the value created by advanced models. His critics hear something more concrete inside that argument: support for regulatory tactics that would make enterprises back away from Chinese or broadly open models, whether or not those models are competitive on the merits. And this is where the debate often slides past itself. One side talks about safety, national security, and strategic control. The other talks about competition, access, and whether concentrated control over models becomes a rent extraction machine. Both sets of concerns are real, but they are not interchangeable. If the main fear is misuse, then the policy case should focus on measurable risk from deployment and capability spread. If the main fear is economic disruption, then the argument is really about protecting premium model pricing and the infrastructure stack built around it. Those can overlap, but pretending they're the same thing muddies the analysis. The market concern is straightforward enough. If open weight models get cheap and good enough, they can pull demand away from premium frontier offerings like the examples people cite, Fable 5 and GPT 5.6. That would pressure margins not only for model vendors, but for the compute and hosting businesses, priced on expectations of persistent scarcity and premium spend. That doesn't prove open models are bad policy. It proves they threaten existing revenue assumptions. China's strategy sits right in the middle of this. A common argument is that US export controls may have pushed China toward open-source AI, and that the pivot could turn a short-term hardware disadvantage into a longer-term distribution advantage. The logic is plausible. If you can't dominate the absolute frontier as easily, you can still try to dominate adoption by making capable models widely available, especially in the global south and among states that don't want to depend on US platforms. Chinese leadership has framed openness as win-win innovation, but it's hard to treat that as purely technocratic language. It's also geopolitical branding, openness as a contrast with American gatekeeping. Still, there's a constraint here that hype can hide. Open release is not the same as large-scale service delivery. Reports around Moonshot's Kimi K3 saturating GPU capacity and pausing new subscriptions point to a basic bottleneck. A lab can release a strong model and still lack the high-bandwidth memory, advanced packaging, and inference infrastructure needed to serve massive demand. So the best-supported version of the China story is mixed. China may be able to use openness to expand influence and adoption, especially where cost matters most. What is less clear is whether Chinese labs can reliably support global consumer-scale usage at the level needed to fully convert technical momentum into platform dominance. Now bring in enterprise adoption, because this is where a lot of these policy fights cash out. KPMG research saying only 12% of companies are getting real business value from AI should temper a lot of dramatic claims. If that's even roughly right, most enterprises are still in a fragile phase where switching costs, compliance, anxiety, and pricing changes can reshape decisions very quickly. That means cheaper open models could matter a lot, especially for firms that don't need the absolute frontier and mostly want acceptable performance at lower cost. But regulatory signaling could cancel out some of that advantage. A model can be technically adequate and economically attractive, yet still become commercially toxic if customers think future scrutiny is coming. So there are two forces pushing in opposite directions: open models pulling prices down, and policy risk pushing regulated buyers back toward approved vendors. The second-order effect is bigger than any single product launch. This could determine which companies capture AI rents, whether the Global South gets a more plural model ecosystem, and whether US policy ends up protecting safety, protecting incumbents, or both at once. Right now, the cleanest conclusion is that the governance fight is not separate from the market fight. It's one contest over distribution, control, and legitimacy, with security arguments, business models, and geopolitics all stacked on top of each other. That's the picture for now. A policy debate that sounds moral, looks strategic, and may end up deciding who gets to sell intelligence at scale. Thanks for listening to Podkey Slopcast. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.